welcome to the Office of State Archaeology's 2019 lecture series. Throughout the year, the OSA will be hosting speakers each month to present archaeological research conducted throughout the state and around the region. All lectures are free and open to the public, and this year we will be continuing to live stream and post the lectures onto the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources YouTube channel afterwards. In light of today's talk, I'd like to acknowledge that Governor Roy Cooper has signed a proclamation declaring March as Women's History Month in honor of women's contributions to North Carolina and the nation. This month also marks the beginning of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources campaign entitled She Changed the World, North Carolina Women Breaking Barriers, which honors the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, which will continue through November 2020. As part of a national campaign to commemorate this historic event, the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources will be hosting and highlighting events statewide that focus on North Carolina women, past and present, who have achieved amazing things in multiple disciplines and help make the world a better place. It's now my honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Rachel Briggs. Rachel completed her undergraduate degree in anthropology and global studies from Warren Wilson College, where she worked extensively at the Berry site, the location of the 16th century native town of Jawara and Spanish Fort San Juan. She went on to complete her master's and PhD work at the University of Alabama, where her research focused on Mississippian foodways, identity, gender, and the emergence of complex societies in the Southeastern United States. Her dissertation is entitled From Bitter Seeds, the Role of Hominy Foodway in the Early Historic Moundville, or the Early History of Moundville. She is currently a teaching assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And today, Rachel will present How Women Created the Mississippian World at Moundville, AD 1070 to 1200. Please welcome Dr. Rachel Briggs.
Hi, welcome. I feel like I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. This is an amazing program, but on top of it, this is an amazing theme, celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage, or celebrating 100 years of women gaining the right to vote, and the celebration of amazing North Carolinian women, and I'm about to talk about women in Alabama. But I think there's a really common theme here. Part of the suffragette movement was a proto-feminist theory. And that theory wasn't just about acknowledging that women should have equal rights to men, as well as all genders should have equal rights, but additionally that there was a lived experience that women were engaging in, and that experience needed adequate representation. And that was the kind of representation that only women could provide. It was something that they just felt, and I agree to this day, that women need to represent women. When we take that kind of view, that feminist view, we can even apply it to our archaeological record. Feminist theory and gendered theory, these aren't just ideas. These are great heuristic devices that can help us come up with really meaningful ideas about the ways people live and the past ways that people lived. Despite this, sometimes we forget this, and we tend to look at the prehistoric record sometimes as just people, as if it's agendered or asexual. When we begin to apply these lenses, though, I think something really important happens. Today, I would like to focus on a particular case study in a particular time period and show, again, how I really think feminist theory and gendered theory is such a powerful heuristic device. In particular, I want to look at the relationship between maize and social complexity in Mississippian societies in the Southeastern United States. My case study is going to focus in the Black Warrior River Valley, but before we really get to our case study, a little bit of a background. For a really long time now, archaeologists and researchers, we've realized that there's some kind of synergistic relationship between the adoption and spread of maize and maize agriculture in the Southeast, and then the development of socially complex societies that we've called Mississippian societies. We haven't been the best at modeling this relationship. Many times the way that we've looked at it is from what came after. In other words, we've looked at the way that maize was utilized as a resource in these socially complex societies later. So in other words, how maize helped provision some of our elites, how it helped support craft specialists. And we take those ideas and then we project it back. And it tended to lead to this idea that maize was adopted because it could be used as a resource to support social complexity, so that it could support elite. But I think that that idea is a bit backwards. As a food researcher, one of the things I'm really interested in and have always been really interested in is why we eat what we eat. And to date, in all of my classes and all of my conversations, I have yet to find someone who says, well, I started eating that food because it was great at provisioning other people as a resource. They always simply say, I eat it because I like it. And I think that's an important place to begin. And when we even just take that simple idea, eating food because we like food, and then adopting food because we like it, we get an entirely different idea of what's going on here. Archaeologically and nutritionally, there are some lines of evidence that help support this thinking. We'll go over several of those today. But one of those to begin with, to just knock out this idea that maize in and of itself was really what was adopted, is the fact that maize, just this plant, just this resource, is not actually a really good dietary staple. If you try to live off of 40 to 50% of your daily caloric intake from maize throughout your lifetime, you're probably going to get really sick and develop some pretty nasty side effects. It turns out what makes maize such an extraordinary dietary staple is when it's nixtamalized or alkaline cooked. And that entire idea is wrapped up in an impressive culinary preparation. It's wrapped up in a number of different tools. It has a number of different elements of sociality that when we really start to tease out have really important implications for women. Now, really quickly, like I said, the case study I want to focus on today. My research is largely focused on the site of Moundville in the west central Alabama. It's in the Black Warrior River Valley. Moundville was the second largest Mississippian center in the Mississippian world, second only to Cahokia. We're going to focus on early Moundville, and arguably even the time right before Moundville, so the late Woodland into the early Mississippian period. We're going to talk a lot today about the different pots and the different foods that were made, particularly those dietary staples, and then the change that takes place. We're also going to apply a gendered lens to this. In other words, instead of just saying people were making acorns, people were making pots, goal 2 is to say that women were making and cooking acorn. Women were making these pots. Women were undergoing this. And we have a good reason to believe that, yes, this was women. That's largely going to come from our ethnohistoric data, which we'll go over a little bit as well. The goal, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, this is a kind of complex argument. And so it involves pulling on a number of different lines of evidence as well as a number of different ideas. I'm going to try to keep it to the stuff that I think is the coolest. If I, though, skip over something that you really want me to go in depth in later, just raise your hand. I will talk endlessly about it, I promise. But what we're really going to focus on today, I want to focus on some of the ceramics. I really want to focus on the foodways. And then I want to focus on another element that I think is involved in this early maize hominy foodway, this agricultural package. It's actually matrilineality. Potentially that this prolific kinship practice of tracing native heritage through the mother side of the family may be another Mississippian trait that should be wrapped up in this entire process as well. Something we haven't talked a lot about. We tend to think it has really great antiquity, but I think one of the emerging pictures that comes out of this research is the suggestion that it's actually another Mississippian characteristic. So today, heavy focus on women and this thing called the hominy foodway. Before I dive too much into this, the difference between a food and a foodway. A foodway is going to encompass all of those aspects of the food. It's not just the raw ingredient, it's the preparation technique, it's the sociality, it's the tools, it's the meaning that becomes involved in it. It's a huge idea. And sometimes it's a really cumbersome idea when we want to apply it to present day situations because our relationship with food is extraordinarily complicated. It just is, right? And from the archaeological standpoint, though, it's sometimes a little easier to use this term because we have a more limited picture. So we're going to talk a whole lot about all of these different elements that surrounded the hominy foodway, and then ultimately those that I think helped create this new Mississippian identity that led to the creation of Moundville. My research began with an extensive ethnohistoric review. We know maize shows up in the late pre-contact Southeastern United States, that it seems to be a predecessor to Mississippian societies, but we weren't really sure exactly how it was prepared. Part of this comes from the perspective that we tend to think you can use foods in a million different ways, and you can, but we also have a really strong attachment to certain foodways. For example, we can talk about how in American society we love wheat, and we do love wheat, but more specifically we love bread, and we love pasta, and we love cookies, and we love biscuits, and things along these lines. There are a lot of wheat products we don't particularly like. So I wanted to investigate if there was a particular maize foodway, and not just the idea that maize could be prepared in any different way, but if there was one particular foodway that seemed to be related, that seemed to be at the basis of this spread. And I was actually really shocked. When I began my ethnohistoric research, what I found almost instantly was that there was one maize-based foodway that was prolific, that was widespread, and that was really loved. I call it the hominy foodway. Now, hominy is a European term, it's an English term, and it's perhaps not the right term to use. Every group had a different term for this, but basically it refers to a dish of boiled maize kernels. They can either be ground up or they can be whole, that have been soaked in an alkaline solution overnight. Now, this alkaline solution is usually made from wood ash, so the ash that is left over after you burn wood. So wood ash or lye made from wood ash. Lye is just the liquid that if you pack in wood ash into something and you seep hot water through it, it's that liquid that comes out. So hominy, maize kernels that have been soaked in these alkaline solutions and then boiled. And that dish, the description of that dish is just prolific, both geographically and temporally throughout the historic native eastern woodlands. It was unreal, the consistency that I saw in this. The steps, while sometimes they vary, sometimes groups grind the maize to really fine pieces, some never do. Some use, as I said, wood ash from hickory or potentially wood ash from other hardwoods, sometimes lye. There's still a pretty strong consistency. One of those elements that I found really intriguing and I was actually shocked by is exactly how long it's boiled for. It can be boiled, reports indicate it can be boiled anywhere from an hour to sometimes 10 or 12 hours. In other words, it's not just the process of cooking this until it's edible or eatable in our terms, but also achieving a very particular consistency and texture. If anyone in here has ever taken hard flint maize and boiled it for a really long period of time, at about the 10-hour mark, I mean, we're talking about just something that has completely fallen apart. It is an entirely different texture and consistency than a pot of grits or even just really quickly cooked green corn. So, like I said, I was shocked. I found so many references to this, suggesting this really prolific, widespread practiced foodway. What I was also shocked by was the sociality that surrounded this foodway that also seemed to be very consistent and very prolific. Hominy, in particular, was heavily associated with the home and with concepts of domesticity. So what do I mean by that? I particularly mean that many of the tools that are used in this process of making hominy became stand-ins for the home. There are descriptions of pots, cooking pots, as symbols of the home. A good home has a cooking pot in the middle of it, or something along those lines. As in, this suggests that once you see this, you're in this place that has this idea of home and an appropriate domesticity. Connected with ideas of health and medicine. This, to some extent, is less surprising. Hominy is an easily digested food if it's prepared correctly, and it was many times referenced as being used as a sick food or as a food that you would serve strangers when they first enter your house. There are also a number of references that suggest it was integral to the concept of femininity and to womanhood. I like to equate this when I'm teaching about this in my classes. I like to tell my students this is similar to, in my household, how important ham biscuits are. My great-grandmother used to always tell me that good women scored their biscuits, and that this was really an important element, and that she was actually ashamed if my mother once made biscuits that she didn't score, and she was utterly ashamed of that because good women score their biscuits. I will always remember that moment. That was a really awkward Easter dinner. This concept of the hominy pot, of this dish and its essential nature to what it meant to be a woman, was really wrapped up. They are intertwined in so many really interesting ways. And part of it, I think, certainly stems from how intensive a food this is. We, on average, studies have shown that on average today, we spend between 20 minutes and an hour preparing all of our food that we eat in a day. Hominy from start to finish is hours to days to make. So this is one of those practices that I think was really essential to structuring female practices or everyday activities, and as such became an essential element of what it meant to understand. If you're trying to understand what it means to be a woman, these elements of that, it has to do with this practice. And then finally, I have down here bitter taste. One of the things that I found really shocking in this research were references to the taste of hominy. Some people love it, some people prize it. Others, particularly many Europeans who are sampling this for the first time, talk about how bitter and honestly unfavorable they find it. They, one particular, let's see if I have this in here. I don't. One particular quote, it's this amazing quote, says that the way that they cook their corn and this ash they add, it can only be because they're trying to pay penance to their gods, because it's just so gross, pretty much. That's the takeaway. It's like, who could ever like this? This must be a sacrifice. But it's not, and it wasn't. And in fact, this bitter taste was highly prized. It was prized so much that wood ash, which is really where this taste is coming from, this bitterness is coming from, it was used as a condiment. When you sometimes received a pot or a bowl of hominy and you were eating this, a common thing that people might do is add ash back into it, mix it in and then eat it. And I've done it. It definitely imparts a flavor, a different flavor. And while this was something that many of our Europeans who were first sampling it really weren't accustomed to, like I said, this was a prized and important flavor and texture for many of our native communities. I was really shocked by that. Now, taking these findings, I wanted to apply them to the prehistoric, the pre-contact, late pre-contact Southeast. While there are a number of elements of the hominy foodway that are really identifiable in the ethnohistoric record, many of those don't translate into the archaeological record. It's really difficult to identify hardwood ash, for example, and its use in culinary preparation from an archaeological standpoint. This isn't something that residue analysis can pick up or anything like that. So I realized I needed to pivot. And what I wanted to start looking at were the tools, these tools that were so essential to this foodway. And when I did my literature review of the Mississippian period, I realized that in conjunction with maize agriculture, in many areas, one very early prolific signature of Mississippian that shows up earlier than other elements was shell-tempered Mississippian standard jars. And I wondered if there was a connection between these two, if there was a connection between these two signatures of Mississippian identity, but ultimately maybe if there was a culinary connection. So I chose my subject area, Moundville in West Central Alabama, and I wanted to look at what came before the Mississippian standard jar, what came before maize, and then what happens after these enter an area, and to see if I could detect specific changes in these foodways, and if I could detect changes in the practice of women. Late woodland foodways in central Alabama, largely characterized by, first of all, women were producing these ovaloid jars. They are typically pointed down, they're pretty tall, and we think we have every good reason to believe that the primary dietary carbohydrate they were cooking in these were acorns. There are definitely similarities between the acorn foodway and the hominy foodway, which we'll get into, but one of the important differences between these two is that acorns don't take quite as long to cook. They don't take quite as long to turn into an acorn mush. And this is what we believe they were creating, was more of an acorn mush than something like turning it into flour and creating doughs. We think this was like an acorn porridge, acorn mush. Now, during the late Woodland West Jefferson phase, maize and shell-tempered jars begin to trickle into the area. And over the next 100 years, before this full-fledged Mississippian identity really takes root, what we see is that we have a completely different pottery form. These Mississippian jars, they're squat, they're globular, they have handles. There are differences, of course, in maize production as well, but we'll get into that in a second. Importantly, though, when we see this Mississippian identity, when we really identified archaeologically, shell-tempered globular jars and maize are dominant. They are the dominant dietary carbohydrate. They are the dominant ceramic technology that's being used. So I wondered, was there a trade-off going on here? What was that trade-off? Was the Mississippian Standard Jar a better tool for something? And if it was a better tool, what was that something? What was it better at potentially than these tall ovaloid jars? I mean, to change your pottery practices and to change what you're cooking, that's a pretty big transition. So what was going on here? I conducted a morphological analysis. I looked at the bodies and the shapes of these two different forms and potentially the way they were used. And what I proposed was that these tall ovaloid jars, they're really good for being placed directly in fires. But these squat Mississippian globular jars, they're a lot better at hot coal cooking. In other words, when you place them directly in fires, this diagram, I don't know how easy it is to see. This diagram is attempting to demonstrate that when you place these squat jars in fires, flames tend to lap up over them. On top of it, the ash bed within a fire is a lot cooler than the flames around it. And with Mississippian Standard jars, that means a substantial portion of the contents of these jars is not being heat exposed. Unlike these ovaloid jars, where the majority within open fires, the majority of the contents, they are getting heat. Change that and look at them when they're in a setup suspended over hot coals, and the Mississippian Standard Jar, the majority of the contents are now getting heat treatment. Whereas these ovaloid jars, almost half of the contents, if we fill it just 2/3 full, which is what we would expect these to be filled at, not getting heat treatment. So I proposed that Mississippian Standard jars are better at being suspended over hot coals. Now, for anyone in the room who is proficient at cooking over open fires versus cooking over coals, there's also a really big difference in these two cooking methods. And one is that hot coals are a great long-term heat. They stay hot for a good long time. So I thought that this hot coal cooking setup was also about giving that nice long heat treatment needed to the hominy dish to nixtamalize it, to help increase this nutritional content, that it was a better setup for that than these ovaloid jars over these open fires. There were a couple of ways that I tested this. One of the ways that I looked at this was I did a morphological analysis of these jars at Moundville. I proposed a hypothesis that if this is hominy and if they're cooking it this way and they don't change that process, then over the 400-year period that these jars are being made at Moundville, stylistically they should change, but morphologically, those elements that are important to what make them a tool shouldn't change. And so I analyzed jars from this 400-year period. I did a principal components analysis to test to see if these morphological elements of the jar change. And lo and behold, stylistic elements change. In other words, incising patterns change, shapes of handles change, even the applique on handles change, but the body itself stays the same. The body never seems to change, suggesting that that body, that shape was really important, that it was a tool and that it served a particular purpose. Again, my proposal that it's for nixtamalizing hominy. The other way we tested this, and this was the most fun, by the way, we cooked. We cooked a lot of hominy. It was awesome. So I had replica jars made by Tammy Bean. She is an amazing potter, by the way. based on West Jefferson schematics, as well as some beautiful recovered whole vessels from Moundville. So we proposed that if these conditions really were better for cooking hominy in these particular setups, then by actually doing this, we should see a difference. And lo and behold, we really did. There were a number of different variables we controlled for, and we can talk about firewood later if you want to. We have found out some great stuff about firewood. But one of the things that was really impressive was that using hardwood, hot coals, under a pot of hominy, that it would stay hot for a really long time. This diagram, the red lines represent every time we added hot coals underneath the pot. And you can see by the time we added our last set of coals, this pot stayed hot, I think enough to cook to some extent, or at least simmer this hominy for hours afterward. It was really impressive. Conversely, when you're cooking in an open fire, if you don't keep maintaining the wood, the flames are going to die down. They're going to stop heating the rest of the pot, and it's going to slowly start cooling. In other words, not as good for this long-term heating process that seems to be so essential to making hominy. So, whether you're with me or not, I'm arguing hominy, early Moundville. And importantly, that women are making a trade-off. Now, this feeds into a big argument that Mississippian, that pre-contact archaeologists have been engaged in a while, which is, okay, so women are making hominy. How do we know that it's not just all Mississippian women moving to this area and completely relocating the local women? How do we know it's local women? Or can we tell if it's local women who start adopting this? And then are they doing it through trade, or are they doing it through what? So in other words, part of this research required having to tease out as much as I could about this early social landscape of early Moundville. Based on ceramic evidence, as well as based on architectural evidence, I think there's good evidence to suggest that this was a multi-ethnic early landscape. That during the West Jefferson period, we start to see non-local people move in. In particular, I'm going to argue non-local women who move in. They bring their foodways with them. And then we start to see this movement toward a strong Mississippian identity. So we have a local architectural tradition that becomes replaced. We have this local endemic foodway that becomes replaced. And then we start to see other things that take off too. We eventually see the construction of large earthen platform mounds, the palisade at Moundville, these other things. One of the important elements of this too, though, is the context that hominy would be spreading in. So this early social landscape, whether it's multi-ethnic or not, we have always assumed that feasting was an essential element in early Mississippian development, that maize was used as this resource to pull people in, that it was used as this resource to host these large feasts. But one of the shocking things about West Central Alabama, we have virtually no evidence for feast. We have one good context. It comes from a late Moundville 1 phase site, and that's about it. The rest of it really seems to be, there seems to be no evidence for feasting. So what is the takeaway from this? By the way, I'm going to try not to flood you with a ton of information that led me to some of these conclusions, but I do want to give you a little bit of one of them. In order to assess whether this really was a multi-ethnic landscape or not, and to assess how these foodways could, or how this hominy foodway could be spreading, I wanted to look at the various sites that are within this area, the early Moundville sites, and I wanted to see if they had any evidence for intermingling, or if they seemed to be really separate. And I took as my unit of analysis Mississippian standard jars. At this point, Mississippian standard jars are dominant. And while the body of that jar doesn't change, and it's not going to change, and I would not expect it to change between these sites, there are those stylistic elements. And those stylistic elements, they mean something. They're really important. They're signaling something to others. Based on whether we're looking at high visibility, stylistic elements. So for example, in sizing traditions, you can easily see different handle patterns. Or whether we're talking about low visibility stylistic elements like rim treatments and things like that, the things that anyone just looking at it may not be able to quickly pick up on. Those have an important meaning. For our purposes, one of the things that they indicate are the communities of practice that women learn to make these pots in. In other words, rim treatments in particular, these low visibility things, they signal to others, or they signal to at least the person making it, where they learned to do this from. The analogy I like to use in my classes is the difference between your clothing and your underwear. Your clothing would be an excellent example of a high visibility something, like think of this as things that other people see, whereas your underwear is something that other people don't see. You know about it though, and you know what you're wearing. But that tends to signal something about who taught you what was appropriate. It's not something that's out of pressure. In other words, it's not something that other people just looking at you has a social pressure on. This is just something that's all about you. So when we're talking about rim styles, we're talking about things that are going to be susceptible to a far different pressure. They're not something that other people are going to see. Whereas these stylistic elements are something that other people are going to see. So the proposal, if this is a multi-ethnic, inclusive early landscape where people are heavily interacting, we shouldn't see styles centralized in certain areas. In other words, we shouldn't see communities of practice that are easily delineated. If it is inclusive, if it is this multi-ethnic landscape, we would expect a lot of overlap in these styles. If it isn't, if it's a little less diverse or at least a little bit more hostile to some extent, no overlap. We really expect some clear differentiation between these styles, both high visibility and low visibility. This is ultimately, this is how one of the ways that I analyze this is a reanalysis of rim styles on these pots. We originally had we had 3 different styles. I proposed 2 more. And I know it's hard to see, but one of the things that this shows is that, first of all, they are not divided chronologically. We don't see a differentiation early versus late, Moundville 1. We also don't see a differentiation based on site. We see an overlap in high visibility markers. We see an overlap in low visibility, suggesting that between these communities there was a lot of interaction. And in particular, interaction between the people making these pots, using these pots, and I'm going to argue sharing their technology. If we don't have feasts happening at early Moundville, then how is this foodway being shared and how is this technology being shared? I think it's being shared through everyday domestic meals. I think this is about women and men participating in just some of those elements of hospitality that were mentioned, and that through these everyday meals, people are tasting these foods and they're liking them. And then once they taste them and they like it, part of what they like about this, I think, has to do with the fact that hominy, when it's really boiled for a long period of time, it's got a similar texture and consistency as acorn porridge does, and then that bitter taste. One of the markers, if you will, of acorn porridge is that many are made from red acorns. Red acorns are prolific throughout the Southeast. And arguably, it doesn't matter how hard you try to leach the tannins out of those red acorns, a little bit lasts, usually resulting in an acorn porridge that has a little bit of that bitter taste left over. So I think this bitter taste, this porridgey, somewhat bitter hominy fit well into the endemic native taste profile. And so when individuals taste this, when it's being introduced by these non-local women, they like it. And then local women like it enough that they want to start growing maize, they want to start producing hominy, and they want to start producing the tools that go along with it. Meaning that what we're seeing is, at first, a restructuring of women's daily activities. All of our ethnohistoric evidence suggests that maize and anything involving maize really fell within the purview of women. That's fairly consistent as well. And I don't think there's any reason to think that that's not what's happening here as well. Now, Through this restructuring, I think there's another important element that happens. So with acorns are typically acorn trees, oaks if you will. We're talking about groves. We're talking about groves that were typically taken care of by groups, by villages, and something happens, I think, when we start to switch to maize. I think when we start to switch to maize, we move away from groups, villages taking care of acorn groves as their primary dietary carbohydrate, to families starting to take care of the maize plots that are essential to their maize harvest and to their hominy production, as well as a complete restructuring of women's daily lives. Because of this, I think this leads us to another element of this early Mississippian and ultimately this Mississippian identity that we don't typically attribute to the Mississippian identity. So one, hominy foodway. Two, I think an altering to some extent of the idea of femininity and that idea of womanhood, all of which becomes necessary for establishing an important foundation that we can then use and that aspiring elites could use to construct Moundville, but then two, to a change in kinship system. Now, this change in kinship system, it's really hard to identify right now kinship practices in the Black Warrior River Valley in the pre-contact era. But one of the best evidences for at least a potential shift in this comes from Greg Wilson's work. In his research, which he presented, he wrote in a great book, Everyday Life at Early Moundville, he indicates that by about 1200, there was the small Mississippian occupation in certain areas of Moundville seemed to become formal residence groups. So people moving to Moundville, moving to this area, and that by about 1200, so at this point we're clearly a Mississippian site, but by about this point, it's not that they don't seem attached to the landscape, they seem really attached to it. And in fact, those areas where their ancestors went to move to become residential groups within this larger site. And then by 1250, we see based on his evidence, he argues for the establishment of kin groups that are tied to specific locations. His best evidence for this, and I think it's really great, comes from later in Moundville's history, where people at this point have moved out of Moundville. It's really depopulated compared to its earlier period, but where they've moved to, once individuals die, they seem to bring them back to Moundville, and they seem to be burying them in these residential kin group areas. So there's this important tie to these particular areas that is clearly traced through kinship. So we have this really strong element of kinship coming into play a little later in Moundville's period. In order to suss this out, and in order to make the argument that we are seeing this important development of this important kinship system, which I believe is a matrilineal kinship system, it's important to talk about Mississippian men. Mississippian men versus Mississippian women, if you will. Because what we need to do is we actually need to suss out not just what Mississippian women were doing, but we need to see if we have any evidence from Mississippian men early on. Hominy foodway, this Moundville globular jar, this seems pretty spot on to suggest that we have Mississippian female practices early in Moundville's history. Do we have Mississippian male practices? Based on good ethnohistoric evidence, there are a number of elements of the Mississippian cultural package that we tend to associate with men. The game of chunky is one of those. Warfare activities. Architecture. We tend to attribute the construction of wall trench structures to men, as well as some of the more elite activities that don't necessarily apply to this early period. Within the Black Warrior River Valley, of these that we can trace, first of all, so far at Moundville, we have no evidence that the game of chunky was actually played. We have gaming discs, we have maybe potentially gambling discs, but we've never actually found a chunky stone. So at no point in Moundville's history so far do we have evidence for this Mississippian male activity. But we do have strong and very prolific evidence for wall trench structures. If this is a Mississippian male activity, then this is what I think we can use as a proxy for it. This, though, and this particular tradition, it doesn't begin as early as this Hominy Foodway or these Moundville globular jars. It's later. Wall trench structures don't show up until the early Moundville 1 period, and they don't take off and they don't become the dominant architectural form until late Moundville 1. As such, if we plot out these activities, Mississippian women's activities versus arguably Mississippian male activities, what we see is that these traces for Mississippian women start showing up during the late Woodland period and are really dominant by the early Mississippian period, whereas Mississippian male traits, they're not really showing up until our early Mississippian period and then really strongly by our early Mississippian late Moundville 1 period. I think this suggests a shift in kinship practices. I think during the late Woodland, what we're seeing is that non-local Mississippian women are moving into the area through marriage networks. They're marrying into these families within the area. Once here, they begin to introduce others to their foodway, to their technology through these small, everyday domestic meals. This foodway takes off, this identity starts to take off, and once maize becomes dominant, and once there's a shift in that, that particular primary foodway, women are no longer able to move and to leave their communities. They need to stay and tend to those maize fields. Arguably, they need to stay and tend to that hominy pot. And so we see a shift where now men begin moving around. And in this case, we start to see the shift of Mississippian men moving into this area, attracted through some of those same marriage networks, but now bringing that masculine male, Mississippian male identity to Moundville. All of this stems from this argument about the importance of hominy and the hominy pot. And again, it really is based on this idea that we're seeing this as a particularly, as a female activity. Buy it or not, that's up to you. I love this idea. All in all, I think that feminist applications are underutilized in archaeology. I think that feminist and gendered perspectives have really strong heuristic applications. They help us construct really meaningful ideas and really meaningful models that are very different than many that we take for granted. And this is, I think, a really obvious example of that. For so long in archaeology, we have focused on maize as a resource, as its ability to support an elite population, that we kind of forgot that, well, I mean, you have to adopt it, you have to like it, someone has to start growing it, and someone has to start cooking it. And when you just start to apply that, just that small idea to it, I think we get an entirely different model for how to at least conceptualize this Mississippian identity emerging at the site of Moundville. And with that, I think I'm done. Thank you. I talked for longer than I thought. Do you have any questions?
I can speak loud, but the folks on the line.
Could you define the word you were using, nishmatizing?
So, nishtamalization. Nishtamalization is, the term itself, nishtamal, is actually a Spanish butchering of a Nahuatl word. So this comes from, historically, this is recorded thanks to Spanish colonists, Spanish explorers in the Aztec region. And it's a culinary practice that pretty much follows our basic steps, but among the Aztec as well as among many other groups in Mesoamerica, the final product wasn't a hominy dish, it was actually tortillas. It was this masa foodway. So it's from that we then transfer that culinary process to this. So part of the hominy foodway, I argue, involves this. I used to call it nixtamalization until someone very kindly corrected me and was like, well, if you are saying it's a Nahuatl word, then niche, Rachel, niche. And I was like, oh, thank you.
And what does it do for the dietary quality of the maize?
So maize by itself is not a dietary staple. It's something we can eat, and it's great, but if we try to eat too much of it, it actually results in chronic malnutrition. It results in pellagra, actually. When it's been properly treated, so I argue when it's been nixtamalized or when it's been combined with a source that's high in B vitamins, then it becomes a complete dietary product. So nixtamalization, it actually is a twofold process. It helps to break down the compounds within maize, so it makes it more easily digested. It's in one sense, it's a form of pre-digestion. It's just helping to further break down that maize before you eat it. But it actually does have a biochemical effect where it begins to release some of those B compounds that we otherwise couldn't digest. If we were cows, life would be great. Without that process, though, like we kind of need this extra step to help extract those nutrients. Now, as mentioned, you can complement a diet. So when we're talking about dietary staples, by the way, I mean, in this case, I'm talking about foods that you're extracting 40+% of your daily caloric intake throughout your entire life from. And not all foods are good for that. In fact, most foods are not. We can't get enough nutrients from them to live a healthy, happy life. Maize is one of those. Unless it's properly prepared and nixtamalized, or unless it's paired with a source like beans that are high in B vitamins. Now, I know like many of you, your ears went up on that one, because in the Southeast, a very popular pairing with maize were beans. We were all being taught about the three sisters and their essential role in the native cuisine. However, really good modern evidence suggests that beans weren't disseminated, let alone prolific, in the Southeastern United States until about 1300 AD. So maize enters the scene 900 to 1000 AD. It enters the Black Warrior River Valley about 1070, and it becomes an appropriate dietary staple before beans ever come along. This suggests that it's being nixtamalized. This suggests this whole process. I usually go into that. It's just such a long, but yeah, any other questions about that? All right, well, thank y'all so much.
On behalf of the Office of State Archaeology, I'd like to thank Dr. Rachel Briggs for speaking with us today. I'd also like to thank you all for joining us, and I encourage you to come back next month when we continue our lecture series with ECU professor and maritime archaeologist Dr. Lynn Harris. Be sure to check out our website, archaeology.ncdcr.gov, each month to get the latest information about our upcoming lectures and events. Thank you so much.